In the summer of 1934, the water in a reservoir in central Texas dropped better than 30 feet. There had been no rain since the fall, the wind was hauling dust down from Oklahoma, cattle were going to market months early, and the lake that had drowned an entire valley 7 years before was pulling back from its own banks a few feet a week, leaving behind a cracked grey crust that smelled of fish and silt. By August, a town was coming out of the water, a little more of it every week, the way a body surfaces. The chimneys first, brick stacks standing out of the mud like the stumps of fingers. Then foundations, squared off in the silt. Then a street, with the ruts still in it. The man who walked out onto that bed first, call him Otis Barlow, was no archaeologist and no reporter. He was from one of the families moved out in 27 when they closed the dam, and he knew that street because he had grown up on it. He went down it ankle deep in muck, past chimneys standing alone with no house left around them, counting the lots off from memory, the store, the smith, the mason place on the corner, and somewhere near the middle of it he stopped, because the street did not go where it was supposed to go. It bent left where it should have run straight, and it ran up against masonry that had never stood in his town, a course of block sitting proud of the mud, level as a rule, going nowhere he could account for. The houses he grew up in sat on cedar posts and dry stone footing, cheap and fast, the way everybody built out there. What was standing out of the silt at his boots was cut stone, fitted edge to edge, laid in a foundation course 20 feet wide, and it ran off under the mud in both directions further than he could see. He climbed higher up the slope to where the courthouse had stood, the one stone building the town ever had, and what he saw there put him down on the ground. The courthouse was sitting on a platform bigger than the courthouse. On all four sides, out from under the collapsed walls, ran coursed stone that nobody who built that courthouse had ever laid. His town had not been the first one in that valley. His town had been built on top of another one, and had been sitting on it his whole childhood, without a soul in it ever wondering why the courthouse ground was so flat, and the water had come down, this one time, exactly far enough to show it. Barlow went back up the bank, and told whoever would listen, which in a county that summer was not many people, because everyone had a dying crop, and nobody had time for a drowned town. The rains came in October, the lake began to fill, and by the spring of 35 the street and the courses and the platform under the courthouse were under 30 feet of water again. Nobody photographed the masonry, nobody measured the platform. All that comes down to us is a man who said for the rest of his life that he had seen two towns on that lake bed, one set inside the other, and that the lower one was laid up in a stone they do not quarry in that valley. What Otis Barlow walked across in that dry summer, who laid a foundation under a town that should not have had one, and why in 90 years nobody has drawn the water down again to look, that is where the rest of this begins. Before you decide Barlow was confused or sunstruck, understand what 1934 actually was, because it is the single best year in American history for seeing things that are normally underwater. That summer was the worst of the Dust Bowl. The topsoil of 4 states was in the air. There were days that spring when the dust reached the eastern seaboard and men in New York tasted Oklahoma. Something like 80% of the continental United States was in drought. Rivers that had run since anyone kept records went to sand and cracked mud you could drive a wagon across. Reservoirs across Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas dropped so far that the intake towers stood on dry ground, and everywhere it happened, the same thing surfaced: the towns. Because the reservoirs of the 1910s and 1920s were built the cheap way. You do not clear a valley before you flood it if clearing costs money. You buy out the families at whatever price the condemnation board sets. You give them 30 days. You move the church if the congregation is loud enough, and the graveyard if you are made to, and then you close the gates and let the water have the rest, the streets, the foundations, the wells, the walls, the whole standing skeleton of a place where people had lived for 60 years. There are dozens of towns like that under Texas water right now, with their street grids intact, their bridge abutments standing, their cemeteries sometimes moved and sometimes not. They are not legends. They come up in every serious drought, and people photograph them, and then they go back under. So a man walking a drowned Main Street in the summer of 1934 is not an extraordinary claim at all. In that year, in that part of the country, it is a Tuesday. The extraordinary part of Barlow's account is not the town, it is what he says was underneath it. There is a thing archaeologists take so completely for granted that they rarely bother to explain it to anybody outside the field, and it is the whole key to this story. Settlements stack. Across the old world, this is so normal it has its own vocabulary, a tell, a mound built out of nothing but the accumulated debris of a place being rebuilt on itself, layer over layer, for thousands of years. People do not choose where to live at random. They choose the ford, the spring, the defensible bend, the flat above the flood line, the place where two trails cross, the bank where the fish run in spring. And those reasons do not expire. The spring that made a spot good in 3000 BC still makes it good in 1870, which is why so much of the world's archaeology is dug straight down through a living town to reach an older one, and an older one under that, and something older still under that. Now apply that to a Texas river valley. The exact qualities that made settlers put a town there in the 1860s, level ground above the flood, reliable water, a crossing, timber, are the same qualities that would have made that spot obvious to anybody living in that valley at any point in the previous several thousand years. And here is the part that makes the whole thing bite. It is also exactly why the site was chosen for a reservoir. A dam wants a narrow rock throat with a broad, flat basin behind it to hold the water. A town wants that same flat ground in that same basin. So the water goes precisely over the ground that human beings have found most useful for as long as there have been human beings in that country. Not near it, over it. Which means that whatever is stacked in that valley is not scattered across a landscape where you would have to go looking. It is concentrated, layer on layer, in the one spot that now happens to lie under the deepest part of the water, and the only thing on earth that ever pulls the cover off it is a drought. Of everything Barlow described, the bent street, the wide footing, the platform under the courthouse, the detail he would not let go of for the rest of his life was the stone itself. He said it was not from there. This sounds like the kind of thing a man says to make a story better, but it is actually the most checkable claim in the whole account, because building stone is local by necessity and always has been. Nobody hauls rock for fun. A cubic foot of limestone runs better than 150 pounds. A single foundation block can go half a ton, and before rail and before decent roads, moving it more than a few miles meant oxen, sledges, a river, and an amount of labour that no frontier town in Texas was going to spend on a courthouse footing when there was usable rock in the nearest creek bed. So the stone in any 19th century Texas building tells you where it came from, without anybody having to write it down. You can walk to the outcrop it was cut from. Barlow, who had grown up in that valley and worked it, said the courses under the courthouse did not match anything in it. Different colour, different grain, a different way of breaking when the frost got into it. If he was right about that one thing, it does something specific and hard to argue with. It means whoever laid that platform brought the material in. And bringing stone in over distance without draft animals or wheels or rail is not something anybody does for a shed or a smokehouse. It is the signature of a society that can command labour over a season, organise transport, feed the men doing the hauling, and decide collectively that one particular place is worth building on permanently. Which raises the question that the whole story turns on, not who was in that valley, but what they were doing in it. Here is where the thing stops being a curiosity and starts being a problem, and it hangs on one word in Barlow's account: platform. Not a wall, not a foundation trench, a raised, level, coursed stone surface larger than the building the settlers later put on top of it. That is a specific kind of structure, and across the Americas it means one thing. From the Mississippi Valley to Mexico, the defining monument of the settled cultures of this continent was not a pyramid in the Egyptian sense, and not a temple in the Greek sense. It was a platform, a flat, raised surface, built up deliberately, sometimes over generations, on which something that mattered stood. Cahokia, across the river from present-day St. Louis, was the largest city north of Mexico for centuries. Tens of thousands of people, a planned grid, a plaza, an engineered landscape, and its heart is a 100-foot-tall earthen platform, covering more ground at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza does. That is not fringe. That is standard, uncontested North American archaeology, and it is criminally undertaught in the country that has it. So when a Texas farmer says the courthouse of his childhood was standing on a coursed stone platform wider than the building itself, he is describing, without any idea that he is doing it, the single most characteristic construction of the ancient societies of this continent. And the settlers who built that courthouse would have had no reason to think twice. They found a flat, level, well-drained rise in exactly the spot a town wants, and they put the courthouse on it, the way people have always built on the work of whoever was there first, and never asked why the ground was so obliging. The question is not whether the settlers knew what they were building on. They did not, and there is no reason they should have. The question is what was standing on that platform before the courthouse, and whether the answer is still down there under 30 feet of water. And that is where I have to stop and be honest with you about what this is. I owe you a hard stop, and I would rather lose you for one paragraph than lie to you for 25 minutes. Otis Barlow is a name I am giving to a story. There is no county record of a stone platform under a drowned Texas courthouse, no photograph, no measured drawing, no surviving block of that non-local stone in anybody's collection. That part is told, not proven, and I need you to keep the told and the true in separate hands, because the entire trade this genre works in is blurring them. So here is the line. What is invented is Barlow, the courthouse, the platform, the bent street. What is real, and this is the part that ought to bother you, is every single thing holding it up. The drought of 1934 really was that severe. Texas reservoirs really do hold whole abandoned towns that were never cleared before flooding, and they really do surface in dry years. Settlements really do stack on the same favourable ground for thousands of years, everywhere on Earth, including here. Platform mounds really are the signature monument of ancient North America, and Cahokia really is bigger at the base than the Great Pyramid, and most Americans have never heard of it. And reservoir basins really were sited on exactly the flat, watered, crossable ground that people have been choosing to live on since the end of the Ice Age. None of that needs a stone platform to be true. The platform is a story. What that water is sitting on top of is not. And there is a documented, ugly, entirely unmysterious reason nobody looked before they closed the gates. Here is the fact that turns this from a ghost story into something that should actually make you angry. When those reservoirs went in, through the 1910s, the 20s, the 30s, and on through the enormous federal dam building of the mid-century, there was, for most of that period, no legal requirement that anybody survey what was about to be drowned. No obligation to look for sites, no obligation to record them, no obligation to salvage anything. The valley got bought, the people got moved, and the water came up over whatever was there. It was only later, as the scale of what had been lost became undeniable, that emergency salvage archaeology got organised at all, crews working ahead of the rising water with a fraction of the time and money the job needed, in valleys measured in tens of square miles, choosing what to save the way a triage nurse chooses, knowing most of it would go under unrecorded. They were not being careless, they were being outrun. Everything they did not reach is still down there, not destroyed, drowned, which is a different thing entirely. Sealed under water and silt in the exact valleys human beings had been choosing to live in for 10,000 years, for the plain reason that those valleys were the best land in the country, which is also precisely why we dammed them. So when I ask what is under a Texas reservoir, I am not asking a wild question. I am asking about a known, enormous, systematically unexamined body of evidence sitting under American water right now. And the strangest part is that we get handed the key over and over, and we do not use it. Because the water does come down. It came down in 1934, and it has come down since, in the 50s, in the 80s, in the droughts of this century, hard enough that the towns come back up out of the mud and end up on the evening news. People walk the streets, people find the school steps, the bank vault, the slab where a filling station stood. People take pictures of the foundations and the bridge abutments and post them by the 100. And then the rains come and it all goes back under, and nothing has been recorded that anybody could use, because a crowd with cameras is not a survey, and a photograph of a chimney tells you nothing about what the chimney is standing on. That is the part I cannot get past. Every serious drought is a free excavation of the most systematically ignored archaeology in North America. The ground is exposed, no digging required, no permit to break earth, and the whole thing has an expiration date measured in weeks. And what we do with it is take snapshots of the chimneys, run a segment on the local news about the town that came back, and go home. It would not take a fortune. It would take a couple of people with survey gear and a camera standing on that mud for 10 days before the rain comes, walking transects, mapping what is exposed, so that when the water closes over it, there is at least a record that it was ever there. Nobody does it, and not because of a conspiracy, because it is nobody's job, nobody's grant cycle, and nobody's career. If that makes you angry, good. Comment, share this, send it to somebody who decides where survey money goes. The algorithm decides what gets seen, the drought decides what gets shown, but people decide what gets written down before the water comes back. Go back to the mud one last time, in August of 1934, before the doubt and the platform and the questions, when it is just a hot afternoon and a man in his 30s walking a street he grew up on, in a town that is supposed to be under a lake. Strip away the name and the stone and all the rest of it, and what is left is an image this country produces every single dry year, and then forgets by the next wet one. An ordinary man, standing on ground that was underwater last spring and will be underwater next spring, looking at foundations he cannot account for, with nobody official within 50 miles and no camera in his hands. That is real, whether or not Barlow's platform ever existed, because those valleys really are stacked, and the water really did go over them without anybody looking first, and the drought really does hand the whole thing back, free for a few weeks at a time, to anybody who bothers to walk out on it. Somebody was here before. They chose the same flat ground above the same river for the same reasons we did, and they built on it to last. And then a dam went in on schedule, and the gates closed, and the water came up over the top of all of it, and nobody wrote the place down, because writing it down was not in the appropriation. Otis Barlow sitting on the slope looking at a platform bigger than his courthouse is a story, but the thing the story is about, a drowned country under our own reservoirs that we flooded without looking and get shown briefly every time the sky forgets to rain, is the most documented fact in this entire film. The stone is still down there, if it was ever down there at all. The towns are still down there, and that part is not in question. And the next real drought will pull the water back off all of it again, right on schedule, for a few weeks, and hand it to whoever happens to be standing on the bank.